I have known Terry Winch for a very, very long time. My book of poetry that you see here is dedicated to him. He was a mentor as well as a friend and advisor to me in mass transit, a set of open poetry readings I started to go to when I was still in college. And so that set me back thinking about stuff I wrote a long time ago, and this poem which appears in that book that's dedicated to him, Paradise Lost. I was like very, very low in the ambition thing. Paradise Lost. The year turns like a teenager disturbed in sleep, aroused and duller than a rose, as a phrase turns in on itself and fills up with meaning, as the world turns too and keeps turning. We turn. What's called a love of life propels us, an opaque urge to move, though not in any one direction. At the edge of night, we turn back, and the days of our lives turn about us, flooding the sets with a difficult light. We have but one life to live, but it's one that repeats itself constantly. All that it seems we can do is keep moving, hoping within all that turning to turn up another world, one that stands still for a moment, one where a clear guiding light leads on toward some definite end in a straight and simple line. Meanwhile, plants wither and sprout, people are born and die, the sun falls and ascends in the sky, and when the light rises hard over dark cities, the young and the restless arise to search for tomorrow. You have to be kind of old to get that one. I've moved from soap operas to daily comic strips in the meantime. This, I believe. I don't know. I'm pretty sure I don't believe in ghosts or astrology or the tarot or mind reading or life after death or convenient messages from the recently or very long dead or string theory because I don't know what it is, or postmodern cuisine or the keto diet or the South Beach diet or the paleo diet because I'm not a caveman and I'm betting you aren't either, or the wisdom of the crowd, or the voice of the people, or destiny, or all's well that ends well, because it doesn't, and after all, everything ends and some things are just terrible, or progress, or evolution, unless that just means the constancy of inconstancy, or I knew you were going to say that, or trust me, or you can believe me, or nobody respects women more than I do, or I have no idea what you're talking about, or he can't come to the phone right now, or your call is very important to us, or everything happens for a reason, or everything is political, or everything is art, though not everything costs $14 million, or knowledge is power, or economics, or the modern university system, or the Republicans, or the Democrats, but I don't know. I could always be wrong. So I had a request, which doesn't very often happen with poetry readings, so I'm going to honor that request and shift things around so I can read something and be not too self-conscious about how long it takes. Merrill Leffler said that he likes this poem, and I have learned that you should do what Merrill Leffler says you should do. It's called I Stopped Writing Poetry. And it actually is about a period during which I stopped writing poetry, and it's not entirely lies. And it has two epigrams. One is, poetry gives no adequate return in money, is expensive to print by reason of the waste of space occasioned by its form, and nearly always promulgates illusory concepts of life. It's from the Irish writer Flann O'Brien. And from Martial, the Roman satirist, no one is more confident than a bad poet. I stopped writing poetry when I was just starting to get good at it. First, I got good at rhyme, so I cast it away. Then I got good at line and stanza construction, so good I hardly needed to say anything at all. My meanings emerged in the spaces between. So I got rid of that too. Metaphor, metonymy, elusive echoes of my betters. Well, frankly, I was a whiz at all that stuff pretty early on. So I emptied out the file drawers of rhetorical strategy, musical form, continuity, or criticism of tradition, and I just wrote. Finally, I found I was writing prose, like everyone else, but it was prose with a difference. Prose with a rich, totally hidden other life lying behind it, unglimpsed, I think, by the reader. Not like a prostitute who reforms and becomes a nun. I've seen that movie. More like a nun who becomes a prostitute. I stopped writing poetry at 16, seriously. Then again at about 20, but only for 6 months. Once again at 27, then at 32, 35, 40, and 42. I'll keep you posted. I stopped writing poetry when I realized I understood romantic and symbolist poetry, sound sculpture, objective verse, conceptual art, pure language, the confessional and elegiac modes, and still everything I wanted to do in poetry, pretty much everything I wanted anyone at all to do, had been done already and much better by Don Marquis in the Archie and Mehitable poems. I stopped writing poetry when everyone else did, in the early 90s, when television became more interesting than culture. I stopped writing poetry when they came and deactivated my poetry button. I stopped writing poetry when I got married, settled down, this is a while ago, since the laws of the state of Maryland do not allow me to marry the love of my life, though I'm not here to whine about it, and maybe marriage would ruin me, as it seems to have ruined others. But one thing I know, it is certainly nice to have someone to blame for taking it easy and resisting inspiration when it inconveniently insists on arising occasionally, no matter what you do. P.S. Thanks for the dashes, Emily Dickinson. I stopped writing poetry because the last thing I ever wanted was to develop some obnoxious false self masquerading as voice, the way artists, as soon as their style becomes identifiable, are stuck in it and in what it will allow them to think style is a correlative personality or a way to explore transcendent issues that lie beyond mere worldly content. Style is exhaustion, ennui, and fashion and death. I stopped writing poetry when I received the praise of people I admired. It's a terrible thing to receive exactly the attention you want when you are unprepared to admit you might deserve it. Of the many ways in which poets are always going on about how poetry not only receives inspiration from love, but imitates it in form and feeling, this just may be the worst. I stopped writing poetry because I saw what it was doing to people's prose style. Yikes. I stopped writing poetry, well, because I'm white. I don't like being white. It isn't a choice I'd make freely, and to get argumentative about it, I don't think it's entirely fair that I have to be white right now when it's so 10 minutes ago, when if I'd been born 15 years earlier, most racists would have considered me anything but, what with the whole Jew as vermin thing. But okay, I concede the point. I'm culturally white or whatever, damn it. And in case you haven't noticed, this just isn't white people's moment poetry-wise. Don't even get me started on the griot tradition and that stuff. Just look at rap, poetry that communicates exquisitely within its chosen boundaries of class and common interest, and hardly at all outside it, except for those to whom it stands as aspiration to cool, just like Shakespeare and Donne. What have white people contributed to culture recently? Postmodernism? Please. On the not very mean streets where I learned versification, poetry wasn't a mode of expression spontaneously developed from living people's lived experience. It was a regime. Well, that's over now. Get over it. I stopped writing poetry when I just ran out of steam. It's really not a whole lot more complicated than that. I stopped writing poetry when my friends started dying. Some of my friends wrote beautifully about the conditions of their illness and insightfully about mortality and their own impending death. Some wrote angrily about their invisibility and created a literature of testimony in which we learn what it was like to walk in the streets of American cities as a ghost. Some wrote poems to memorialize their lovers or to embarrass right-wing senators or arts-funding agencies. But I just counted 67 people I knew and was fond of who've died of AIDS-related illness, and not once have I genuinely felt I could respond to their suffering or death in poetry. Is it poetry? Is it me, the era? I am willing to believe that if Milton and Shelley and Tennyson could do it, it can still mean something. Why should I think their ages made death any more manageable a subject than mine? But whenever I sat down to try, I stopped in despair. Whatever the political advantages of slogans of the time, it wasn't the right words I looked for, but some way to make silence heard in lines of verse, and I never found it. Now even that sounds like a device to me, like special pleading. Fuck it, just fuck it, let someone else do it. I stopped writing poetry, but I still love the stanza. All that other cool stuff, tropes, the caesura, enjambment, I can live without. But the stanza, wow. I stopped writing poetry after I went to my first MLA conference where they were attacking a way of reading and understanding literature they called mainstream and dominant that I'd never even encountered. It was like what they meant by book was totally different from what I meant by book, as different as washing machine and golf ball. I stopped writing poetry when it was eclipsed by criticism for purely sociological and economic reasons. I stopped writing poetry when people began writing scholarly articles explaining how to write Frank O'Hara's lunch poems, and it never occurred to them to mention that you should read them during lunch. I stopped writing poetry when it became popular. I realized Robert Frost read it at Kennedy's inauguration, but now Ethan Hawke is telling Vanity Fair that he keeps your book by his bed, and this actually happened to someone I know recently, like 30 years later. And poetry as adjunct to commercial culture and the veneration of celebrity is so much more deliciously embarrassing for everyone than even poetry in the service of the state. I stopped writing poetry when taking it seriously started seeming more likely to indicate intellectual complacency than intellectual liveliness. I stopped writing poetry when it got boring. I stopped writing poetry when the internet replaced the telephone, since now that everyone has a phone and takes it everywhere, it's obvious the telephone is over. Ted Berrigan, I thought, destroyed the sonnet by inviting the beloved to just pick up the phone and call him sometime. Thus, no more need to plead and seduce through verse. So the channel changed. It works both ways. Now we are all gay, straight, bi-curious, pleading and seducing in lowercase as only the freest verse used to, hitting reply before the intimacy of communication has time even to register, killing off poetry by creating the first real audience for it in centuries. I stopped writing poetry because I promised to. I read something at the Ear Inn about 1984 in which I encouraged everyone to give up writing as I engaged to, and it went over real big. Afterwards, anytime I ran into any of the poetry crowd, they'd always ask me if I was still not writing. I understood it was a performance piece, and so did they, but I kept getting this gnawing feeling I was abandoning a principle by continuing to write. It was entirely superstition, like actually feeling sick when you call in sick. But I suppose I have been a victim of the terrible conviction that you must mean what you say. I stopped writing poetry when I had dedicated poems to everyone I knew, at least everyone I wanted to impress. I promised to start writing poetry again as soon as I meet some new people. Interesting people, anyway. Interesting people I can't just come out and say things to, anyway. I stopped writing poetry, but as satisfying as it has been to turn my back on it, as on a distant homeland fallen under the spell of a fascist party, still a breeze reaches me from time to time, fragrant of verse, and suddenly I am as nostalgic as an exiled Russian Grand Duke waiting on tables in Paris in a screwball comedy. Sometimes I wonder, would it really be so terrible if I wrote just one more line? So I'm still going to read one more poem because, thank you, because I told Meryl, okay, I'm going to read that, but I'm still going to do my set. This isn't very long, really. It was 4 minutes the other night. It's of the moment. That's why I want to read it. This is some water. I've been doing a lot of incantatory and list type stuff, so I apologize if that's tiresome. This is called Bad News First. What nobody needs to tell you, what everyone knows and no one will admit, what you saw without recognizing, what you heard when you weren't listening, what requires no explanation, what they always say, what can't be justified under any circumstances, what some like and others detest, what was always lurking in the background, where you went to work every day when you went to work, where you came home when you came home, when you surprised yourself, when you disappointed your parents, when you almost lost it, when you told me it was forever and it wasn't forever, when you walked out of the movie before the ending, when you took it whether you liked it or not, when you didn't get it, when it all made sense, when it made too much sense, when it was too easy, when it was too hard, when you dug in your heels, when you promised, when you kept your promise, when you didn't keep your promise, when you treated it all like a big joke, when you thought you couldn't take it one more minute, when you thought you were going to lose it, when I saw your face and knew, when I watched you do it, when I turned away in disgust, when I couldn't help envying you, when I thought you were fucking nuts, when you made terrible choices, when you had no choice, when no one realized what you were up to, when no one knew what they were doing, when no one knew what the fuck was going on, when everyone knew exactly what was happening, when the other shoe dropped, when the earth opened up, when the top of your head blew off, when you gave up, when you lost your mind, when the mirror will no longer reflect your image, when the weather changed, when you met your commitments, what you were looking for before you forgot what you were looking for, what you tried to hide from the children, what you couldn't find words for, what you felt bad about saying even though it had to be said, what made the whole thing so sad, what made the whole thing so boring, what the hostages kept from the captors, what the children kept from the parents, what you stole from your neighbor's yard, how you betrayed your friends, how you made war on mankind, how you explained your appalling behavior, how you knew something was up, how you came to terms with it, how you lived with yourself, how they told you when they had to tell you, how they left out the most important part, how they debased the currency, how they said whatever they needed to, how they maintained their good opinion of themselves, how they exceeded the bounds of simple decency, how they fooled us, how they couldn't fool us, how they kicked us upstairs, how they threw us under the bus, how we were asking for it, why we begged to be humiliated, why we begged to be punched in the face, what it's like to be stranded in this endless desert, what it's like to care, what it's like to know you can't do anything about it, what it's like to know you can, where all those zombies came from, why you can't argue with them, why you can't shame them, why you can't pin them down, why you can't run away, why you can't keep up, desperation, ecstasy, misplaced trust, sleight of hand, bad faith, magic underwear, majority rule, interior design, exterior chaos, prolonged dental surgery, a walk in the park, a day at the races, a slam dunk, an inside straight, a life sentence, a last-ditch attempt, special pleading, mass communication, sheer horror, the light at the end of the tunnel, no light at the end of the tunnel, your enormous house, your terrifying family, your spectacular toilet, your ridiculous bathroom, your point of origin, your destiny. Everything that was funny becomes tragic. Everything that was tragic becomes pointless. Everything that protected us makes us more vulnerable. Everything that saved us ruined us. Everything that can happen will happen. Nothing can be calculated. Nothing can be assessed. Nothing can be analyzed. Nothing can be read. Nothing can be written. Nothing can be foretold. Nothing is the result of sexual repression. Nothing was inherited from one's parents. Nothing is the product of a genetic predisposition. Nothing is certain. Nothing can be confirmed or denied. Nothing can be given freely. Nothing can be distinguished from itself. Nothing can be estranged from itself. Nobody sees the whole thing at once. Nobody hears the words they hope to hear. Nobody feels joy or despair. Nobody learns their lesson. Nobody celebrates. Nobody achieves a state of enlightenment. Nobody experiences the transformation they hoped for. Nobody takes the long way round. Nobody takes a shortcut. Nobody lies awake every single night consumed with worry. Nobody hopes for the best. Nobody prepares for the worst. Nobody says hello. Nobody waves goodbye. Nobody turns the lights out. Thanks. See you next time.